South Africa really well. Yeah. So that's the pool convention. Yeah.
Noswaith da, good evening. Welcome to St Edmund's Church this evening for another meeting of our Friends of St Edmund's. My name is Julian Stedman. I'm the chair of the Friends of St Edmund's, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone tonight. It's really good to have you, and very special welcome to guests from the Netherlands who are sitting in the back row. Great that you've joined us, and hopefully you'll find the talk very interesting. We're delighted to have Eric Gower, who's our church historian. I've been told to put it in inverted commas.
Yes.
To present his fourth talk on the development of the church. Since discovering Mr. Fieldhouse's photo, he has kept everyone in suspense about the special and great discovery that he's made. So we're all in a very privileged position tonight to find out what that discovery is. So I think without further delay, I will hand over to Eric. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. I suppose I deserve it, having had quite a build-up in the publicity. But we will see what we've got here. I'll tell you the story behind this particular photograph. I'll set it in the context of other photographs like it, and then the breakthrough in terms of actually, why was it taken in the first place? About 10 years ago, my eBay account alerted me to the fact that there was something related to Crick Howell on sale. It turned out to be this little photograph. Victorian, obviously, sepia-coloured photograph, but, well, it's the sort of thing that you find in an elderly relative's belongings after they've passed away and you're sorting through. It was marginally interesting, but it looked rather like many another photo of the same sort. Now, just so that you see what we're talking about, I don't expect you to be able to see any detail from where you're sitting, but that's the size of it. And I knew nothing about photos of this size and of the... All right? Can't hear me. Right. Oh, that's a good point. Thank you. I need technical advisors. How about that? How about that? Right, let's try again. This little photo was what I bought for a few pounds, not knowing anything about photos of this size. And I tucked it away and didn't look at it for quite some time. Now, just to let you know that photos of this sort have got a special designation. They were the size of a Victorian visiting card, the sort of thing that if you were really posh, you didn't knock on the door and just go if the person wasn't there. When the servants came to the door, you gave them one of your cards and went on your merry way, having made your presence known to the occupier of the house. This little card, and they always were the same size, measures about, now let's do it in real money first of all, 4 inches by 2.5 inches, or for those of you who don't know what that means, 100 millimetres by 64 millimetres. And they often had the name and address of the photographer on the reverse side. They were known by the French phrase for visiting card. I won't test everybody's French. Carte de visite, or CDV to the English, who don't know how to pronounce French words, however simple. This was the man who invented and patented this format of photography. The earliest photographs were invented by another Frenchman. In fact, the French actually dominated the whole discovery of how to fix photographs. It took the English quite a long time to catch up. So we're talking about the first photograph that actually didn't fade immediately. You exposed it to light again. Was taken in 1826. And then there was a race on to find how to make photographs that were much less cumbersome to produce, and various different sorts of camera and various sorts of processes happened over the next few years. The challenge was to get away from just being able to take one photograph and that was it. And obviously the people concerned had an eye to how they could make some money out of this. And Monsieur Disdery undertook the challenge of producing multiple photographs. I won't go into the process, one, because I don't quite understand it, but two, because it is quite complicated. But it did involve having a special camera. You see the 4 white dots on that. There were 4 different lenses, and each lens could either be triggered at the same time or one after the other, and the plate on which the actual photograph was taken could be moved around inside the camera. First 4 to a plate, and then 8 to a plate. Now this suddenly made the whole process of distributing and making a bit of money out of taking photographs a real possibility. Things really took off when the great and the good, or rather the rich and famous, recognized the potential of having their photos on CDVs. And Monsieur Diderot decided to take a photo of Napoleon III. And here's the photo that actually kicked the whole thing off in a big way. It was a craze, both for the people who wanted their photos on carte de visite, as well as people starting to collect them. And really it was this photo that suddenly the whole thing took off. And there's a quote from him: "I suddenly became popular by inventing the carte de visite, which I had patented in 1854. Now that gives us an earliest date for this. So we are talking about sometime after 1854. And we'll find the real date for it in a moment or two. Of course, not to be outdone by the French, Queen Victoria in 1860 had her photo distributed, and that, of course, was even more popular than the French getting ahead of the game. Suddenly, people all around the country and throughout the empire could own a portrait of the Queen for themselves. Of course, it wasn't long before people started taking photos of other things that would fit into that format. Pets and other animals, they had to be ones that would sit still, because the exposure for the photos at this time was probably a minimum of 3 minutes. So as long as you could get your animal to stand still, you'd actually get quite a good photo coming out the other end. Obviously, you could take a picture of a blur if you really wanted to and just get the pet to move on. The cameras were still quite cumbersome and expensive and had to be operated by somebody who knew what they were doing, and the profession of photographer was really invented on the back of these little photographs. Now, holiday snaps were still quite a long way off, and your average person wouldn't have a camera in their back pocket or in their luggage or in the cart, in the horse and cart outside, and they would go to have their photo taken and produced on one of these. But things that stood still were prime targets for putting onto this. And it wasn't long before somebody thought of putting a building on one of these, because they don't need any persuasion to stand still. So this is an example, and there are many hundreds and hundreds of these produced around about the 1850s through to the 1880s. It was a real craze. It reminded me of the sorts of things that, and I don't suppose it was just boys that did it, but boys collecting cigarette cards when I was a little lad. Now, my parents didn't smoke, my grandfather did. Cards came my way, and there was a great craze for swapping cards. Now, this is in the same sort of genre as that, a real craze, but this time really mostly amongst adults collecting and swapping the cards. So, somebody had the bright idea of taking this picture. When I saw it, first of all, I had to be persuaded it actually was a picture of St. Edmund's, because it's something about it that's a bit different from what we see around the place. But turn the photo over on the other side and your questions are answered, because there is Crick Howell written across the middle of it. And the price of the photo, 1 shilling, 5p for those of you who were born after 1971. There's also the name Fieldhouse, and for some time I didn't know what that name might refer to. We'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. It wasn't obvious whether this was the person who took the photo or the person who owned the photo, and I needed to persuade myself, first of all, that this photo had been taken by a Mr. Fieldhouse. So obviously the immediate reaction is to compare the photo with what we see today. And I'm going to help you with that, because somewhere here I have probably enough handouts for everybody, but if we run out, then Julian, do you think you could do the honours? There should be one each, but yeah. This is an enlargement, a monochrome enlargement of the photo itself. I thought it'd be a lot easier to see than to actually try to study it on the screen. So just wait until Julian has handed them out. If we need to share, not many of us will need to. Oh, very good. I must have known. I later on actually heard about CDVs and realised that this is one of them. And that gives it, as I said just now, an earlier date of 1854. But what's the latest date? Well, it does definitely, if it's 1850s to 1870s, it puts it into the incumbency of this man. Now, until last week, I hadn't actually seen, or was it this week? No, it was last week, wasn't it? I hadn't actually seen this photo. It was buried in the vestry. It was a little worse, its frame was a little worse for wear, and it's the second time its frame has been a little worse for wear, because when I got inside it, I discovered the name of Bob Candy, known to a number of you, and it just said, repaired by Bob Candy. So the frame itself was in a bit of a state. But I got him out of his frame, and this is the Reverend John Evans. He served, first of all, as vicar here under the rectorship of Lord William Somerset, who didn't actually appear here for the whole of the time that he was the rector. He just collected the money from the tithes. If you want to know more about Lord William, then Elizabeth Siberry can give you lots more detail, because at the same time, he was the rector of Llangattock and I think half a dozen other places. most of which he never visited, or if he did, just once to say, "Blessings be upon you," or something. John Evans was here for 35 years, and in 1851 he became rector. It's very interesting. He always seems to sign himself as John Evans BD, just in case you didn't know that he had a Bachelor of Divinity degree. I haven't seen a single signature of his which doesn't have BD written after it, and not written by other people. Now, I thought to myself, a photograph would have to be taken by a photographer. A photographer would have to be persuaded there was something worth taking. Why? Why take a photograph of the inside of this church? So I searched the vestry minute book for the period and suddenly realized that it's almost certain the photo was taken at the end of a major restoration works. That this was a celebration, if you like, of the fact that for 6 or so years the church had been subject to a very significant upheaval. I'll just put you in the picture of what had happened prior to that. Prior to this time of John Evans, these 2 side aisles here had been rebuilt. So in 1828, this one, and in 1838, that one. Why did they need to be rebuilt? Because in 1765, they pulled them down. They pulled them down largely because they were just about to fall down, and because they could use the materials that they recycled from the 2 side aisles into filling up the gaps in here and making the church back to what it was originally, a cruciform church. So that was the big upheaval. Now that's 1828, that side. The new aisle was built. 1838, the aisle on this side was built. And then there's a period of settling down. Nothing happens until John Evans comes along, and as a young man was very good, I think, at spotting opportunities to develop buildings. He came here to Crickhowell and had nowhere to live. The nearest place to Crickhowell that he could afford, or the church could afford for him, was 1.5 miles outside, and I haven't discovered yet where it was. But he found that just above our current rectory, and you'll know that in the current rectory, there's on the hill above it, there is a very large building, which had been a school, a Dane school, and had fallen into disrepair and had been converted into a barn. And John Evans spotted that actually this would make a very good rectory for the town of Crickhowell. So he led the work. I won't say he led the work very hands-on, but he certainly made some really serious decisions, I think, about how to make this large house, which had become a barn, back into a house that could be used for his purposes and generations thereafter. Much too big, of course, but in those days, rectories were that. You only have to go across to Llangattock to see what, a little old rectory looks like. It would only just fit in this church. So they went for the big rectory. It was something about status, but it was also just a very convenient way of actually picking up a big family, where they all seem to have big families. So this work that was celebrated by having a photograph taken was launched in a sermon in December 1866. Now this document here lists the things that were priorities then in December 1866, and the work started almost immediately. First the small work and then the larger. So nothing much had gone on since that side had been rebuilt, and there was lots to be done. And I'll talk about what lots and refer to the photograph as well, because the photograph actually has been taken from a particular angle to focus on the things that changed, the things that were different. A top priority was seating. We seem to have... No, there we are. Now this rather ugly picture is this, which we found in the ringing chamber a few years ago. I think somebody put it up there on the way to the rubbish bin, and it never quite got to the rubbish bin, because at first glance it doesn't really warrant being kept, except that it's quite an important document. Without it, we wouldn't know how the seating arrangements over in that aisle had been made. You'll see, if you look carefully, you can see the date 1828 at the top here somewhere. Yes, in the year 1828. And down this side is a plan of that side of the church and where the pews were going to be put in. Now, it is quite difficult to read even when you get close to it. I'm not expecting you to immediately say, oh, yes, I can see what that's all about. But what it is about is satisfying the requirements of the Incorporated Church Building Society. They offered money because their main interest at the time across the whole of England and Wales was to sponsor new churches and enlarge older churches, because they were concerned, very concerned, that their housing stock didn't actually have enough room for the people that they wanted to bring into church services. And it's, in a sense, one of those sort of rather slightly uncomfortable facts. But I think it was at a time when really they saw the Baptists, the Methodists, the Congregationalists building new churches and filling them, and yet they couldn't actually do anything about the size of their churches, the Anglican churches, So actually, it was a top priority to have proper seating in that that aisle and that aisle, and that's what gave rise to this. And when you study it carefully, the sort of pews that they put in on that side were clearly the box-type pews with a door on the end, and the front ones, that is right up to this wall here, because there was a complete wall, if you remember, there. They were the ones you had to pay for, so you paid a rent for those. But the Incorporated Church Building Society was very definitely on the side of those who couldn't afford to have their own pews. And so they insisted that half the pew, just under half the pews at the back, should have been benches, not box pews, but benches, but there was no charge for those. Now, the observant among you will have seen over the years, if you've come more often than not, that still on the end of these pews at the back is the word free. And it was meant exactly that, not designated to any individual. I'll come back to that in a moment. The proposal was for this new restoration. Now you've got the whole of this space. You've got a bit of a mishmash between pews that were newish, i.e. 20 to 30 years old, and you've got pews that were much older and in much worse condition in the middle. And the decision was taken to re-pew the lot. And this was how it was reported. Let me just show you. That's box pews. Might need to come back to that in a moment. But basically, the pews, box pews, were going to be abandoned because they're not really efficient uses of space. Because it didn't matter how many people came, if the family that occupied half of the box pew, you had no right to ask, could I sit next to you, please? And it was not the done thing to squeeze into somebody else's box pew. So you could actually have several of the box pews absolutely empty. And the ones at the back where you had to go. At the end of the project that we're talking about, this rather splendid comment came in the local newspaper. There weren't many local newspapers, but the Star of Gwent, which no longer exists as far as I can make out, the Star of Gwent reported this: the sacred edifice, i.e. our church, will be entirely reseated with open oak seats, what you're sitting on now, and will be more pleasing to the eye and more comfortable. Don't argue with me, argue with the Star of Gwent. What you're sitting in is more comfortable, and it almost certainly is more comfortable because they are actually better proportioned than any box pew. Box pews tended to just be literally that, square boxes. And if you're sitting inside a square box, it's not long before your back and other regions start to feel the problem that actually you're not made to sit on rectangular things. So they were more comfortable. The pews that we have today, you'll be very familiar with, and they are quite remarkable. I think if you look at them carefully, first of all, they're oak. Many churches at the time were repewed in pine. So this is the hardest wood that they could actually use. And they are made in such a way as to minimize the number of joints that are needed. So what you're sitting on, have a look at what you're sitting on, you'll see that it goes right the way through to the other side. So every one of these pews in the middle section, not the ones on the outside, but the ones in the middle, have a plank 4 meters long by 300 millimeters deep by 3 centimeters. That in old money is 12 feet by 1 foot by 1¼ inches. They are substantial. And I just find it fascinating. We're talking about 1868 when these went in. A tree that actually could yield planks of that size would have to be at least 100 years old and probably nearer 200. So they've been around as useful bits of wood or growing bits of wood for a very long time. I'll leave you to do the sums. So whether you like the pews or not, they more than satisfied the need to give this whole area not only a facelift, but give plenty of scope for where people could sit. The Incorporated Church Building Society paid for them, or paid at least enough for them to be actually purchased, because the front ones still were bringing in rent. And it's the ones at the back. So they didn't get rid entirely of the whole notion of the your pew actually dictating or being dictated by how much money you paid for it. So the ones at the back are free. The ones at the front you will see a red number on, and I actually have got, certainly on the old scheme, the box pew scheme, I've managed to decipher this, and you see names that crop up over and over again on all the documents, the ones who owned the various different big houses around. Now, the other thing that the accounts revealed is that was a new arrangement for the gas. Now, in those days, gas was used only, really, for lighting, and it explains the rather odd things that you probably might not even have noticed. Those who can see here, there's one here. There's one in the middle of that arch there, and you find, lo and behold, there's another one in the middle there, and at the back. Those hide, and if you're sitting in one of the pews where you can actually see below the thing at the top, you'll see it goes all the way down to the floor, because it covers up the gas pipe that is still there. Because obviously there's a bit of a problem hanging anything from the stone arch. It's much easier to come in from below. And so they had uplighters, and I've got postcards which are a little bit older than the cut to visit. And you can see quite clearly, if you come close enough, you can see, and I'll leave them here, you can actually see the uplighters in all of these positions. Obviously, if you've got a wooden ceiling, it's a lot easier to drop it down from the ceiling, and that's what you've got here. And you possibly can't see it. Depends where the screen is. Does the screen get in the way or not? No. Up there. That bit of metal decoration was the site of the gas pipe coming down and the chandelier hanging over this area here. So this was the gas was used for lighting here, and then up in the chancel, same sort of thing again, 2 or 3 chandeliers coming down from above with their gas lights. I'm very pleased that they left that one behind when the building was subsequently, because it's just asking for the question. Well, it did ask me. I asked the question, whatever is that there for? Because it looks too functional to be just a pretty piece of metal. But that's what it is. Now, in the preamble to the accounts, the list of projects that had been agreed is described and ends up with the phrase, now don't boo me at this point, lastly, to warm the church. So one of their priorities was to warm the church. Now, I think we came in today before the doors were wide open and bringing all the cold air in. You would think, actually, this was a necessary thing for the future of the development. One of the advantages of box pews is you can close the door and it keeps the drafts out. And sometimes, in some places, not this one, but in some places you can actually see a pew which has got a fireplace in the end of it. And it would not be unknown for people here to bring, or their servant, to bring a bucket of hot coals for the service. And because they were in the pew, you could warm that little area up quite nicely. So a necessary condition of moving to open pews was that the church should be warm. And you'll see on your picture that these grills, this is where the grills came in, over the hot water pipes, and they go all the way from the boiler down in that corner underneath, right the way up to the chancel and back again. It is a remarkable piece of hot water engineering that it all comes driven from there. And you'll see the pipes are whether these are the original pipes or not, I don't know. But the iron pipes bringing the heat to the people, or as close to the people as they could. Something else in the list of things that were being done at this time was the removal, the removal of Sir John Herbert's tomb. Now, many of you will not have ever seen Sir John Herbert's tomb because it's tucked away. Now, this is one of those unintended consequences. It had originally been placed in front of the altar, and it got in the way of things that needed to be done around the table up there. And so it had been decided to move Sir John and his tomb out of the way. And a special niche was created, and part of this restoration was to move him out of the way. It's sad, really, because I think it's one of those things where a memorial is supposed to remind you. But if you never see it, it's quite difficult to know how you're reminded. So I don't think they were doing anything other than being very practical as far as the movement of people up there is concerned. But at a stroke, they made Sir John Herbert and his story, which is written on the side, worth going and having a look and reading the story, they made him very obscure. I'll leave it like that because I'm pretty disappointed with the Victorians that that was the place they found to put him, only because it just puts him right out of the way. Okay, a major item of the activity was quaintly put as the scraping and cleaning of the pillars. And you look at our pillars today and you wonder, why did they need scraping? You might understand why they needed cleaning, but scraping? Well, actually it was because all of this stonework that you see, probably not the new stones that had been put in the 1828 and 1838 restorations, all of those would have been rendered. And it would be a grey rendering until it was whitewashed. I don't think they ever got round to the whitewash bit. So this would have a very dull feel to it. And I think the idea was that this would be a more consistent way of keeping the walls from the people, or for the people. Of course, if you actually did whitewash it, and lots of churches in Wales were whitewashed on both the inside and the outside, it makes an ideal place for actually creating pictures and texts and making use of it for teaching purposes. But our church needed this render taking off, they decided. Now, if you want to know what it looked like, this slide here shows you what it looks like. This is not some bit of magic, but actually if you go up there to the other side of the crossing and look up, you'll see that the render up there was never taken off. And you'll see what the sort of job was that was needed. In the process, they made a discovery. Now, if you look back on your sheet, the picture, if you look at the top part of that, it looks to me as if they never did get round to taking the render off the front part of this wall here. It certainly doesn't stand out looking like it's actually been cleaned. And there could be a good reason for this. In 1868, so we're partway through the whole thing, this minute appears. A resolution of the church meeting that a qualified builder examine the pillars under the spire of the Church of Crickhowl and state what is necessary to be done, and I think in brackets, and get on and do it. Because actually they had uncovered a disaster. Not a disaster that had happened, but a disaster in the making. Take the rendering off here, they go right down to the floor level, and I don't know, it's not recorded exactly what they found, but it's almost certainly that one of these big stones, or more than one of these stones, was actually broken. And they were left then with a dilemma because they weren't going to be putting render back on. They've got this ugly crack, but more seriously, you've got a tower above here, only at this end supported on these two piers. You've got, at that time, 5 bells being rung, which just adds their weight. And the dynamics of actually ringing bells has been known to bring towers down in all sorts of places. And then you've got a spire with a lot of wood in it. So altogether, you've got enormous weight on here. And they didn't discover it, that there was something wrong with these, until they started taking the render off. So they stopped. And the way that the minutes are written, it was obviously a real crisis. They were partway through the whole project, and they couldn't go any further. So the church was called to a meeting to have the problem explained to them, and they decided that they couldn't decide for themselves what to do. So they sent somebody to Hereford, and you've just got to remember how difficult all this was. Nowadays, we would have emailed them and said, could somebody come and have a look? And then you would have waited months for them to come. But they had the problem that if you wanted to ask somebody to come and have a look, you actually had to go and talk to them. And going to Hereford wasn't just so easy as it might appear to be with your car on the drive. When he came, Mr. Welsh took one look at it and said, there's only one thing that can be done. You have to take down all of these stones right the way up to where the arch begins. Now remember, this was a whole wall here. We didn't have this archway here cut. And the stones here are pretty enormous. So obviously the arch had to be supported, and then the major job of taking these stones out and replacing them after you've put the concrete in to provide a foundation. Almost certainly what they discovered was that there was no foundation at all, and that they'd been very carefully balanced on a good support of sand underneath the whole thing. Fortunately, they did take that render off and they did discover it, because otherwise, eventually, and it might have taken a bit longer time with the render still on it, that part of the church would be unsafe, and that means that the whole of the church would have been unsafe as well. So where we're sitting here today might not have existed if they hadn't done the sensible thing, which is to check out what on earth is going on underneath there. It accounts for the nervousness. You remember, perhaps if you were here to a previous talk, when I talked about the organ and the fact that these arches were cut, you can see why they were nervous about those arches being cut. And they sent a delegation down to Cardiff to find out whether this was actually a sensible job. I think on the basis that they had actually done this work here, it was agreed that cutting those arches wouldn't be a problem. However, that nervousness went on. because in 1934, when they came to hang an extra 3 bells up here, there was a huge debate as to whether the bells could be hung to be rung, swung, rung, or whether they had to be chimed. And the architect said it was a waste of a good set of bells just to have them chimed, which is quite an interesting thing for an architect to say. But the church, I think, this story of what might have happened was obviously still in the memory. And so they decided to chime rather than to swing these bells. So that accounts for why we have quiet little chiming bells, thank you, Kerry, but not big, loud bells like you get when you can actually hang them the right way up or the wrong way up and swing them to ring them. So let's move on. We've averted a disaster. What else? Well, this was the thing that drew my attention that there might be something in this photograph. Look again and look at the pulpit. And look what appears to be coming out of the side of the pulpit. What appears to be coming out of the side of the pulpit here is that balustrade there. And at some time after the pulpit, which was put in new during the 1868 restoration, at some point, and I think the point was when they did the organ, so back onwards into 1882, they turned the whole thing round slightly. However, it rather destroyed this very neat design. From where I'm standing here, I can see the pulpit exactly as it should have been, with all the faces pointing towards the congregation, instead of which you can only see this one and this one if you're sitting over there, and only see this one and this poor chap round the side here you probably didn't know existed. That's worried me for a long time. That actually, why did they build it like that? Well, they didn't. They built it properly, and then at a later stage, they turned the whole thing through 90 degrees. So the steps went up from this side, and the balustrade is the indication that things had altered. Now, the new pulpit was very carefully designed, and I'm sure the man concerned probably wasn't around at the time, because I think he would have been heartbroken to think that his 4 gospel writers were actually 3.5 gospel writers, or even 2 gospel writers, depending on where you sit. Those are the 4. That's the way it should have been, facing you, like that. And it isn't facing anybody like that unless they're sitting in the middle of here. Then, if you look carefully, and it took me quite a long time to work this out from the photograph, there appears to be this wall here behind me, but at a different height. What was going on? Well, they actually turned this wall into something that could be used as a reading desk. So over here, on this side, you can actually make out the top part, you can actually make out a Bible, or a large book. You can't be sure it's a Bible, but it's pretty well obvious it will be. A Bible, which was for use during the services. So it was actually at a proper height. So this has been shrunk down. Now, these two things are connected in the sense that the shrinking of this and the turning of the balustrade around all were done to enable the choir to actually be seen. And that was not until the choir stalls were the choir stalls were installed in 1882-3. So actually, all the work that went on building up this wall here as a reading desk, putting the pulpit in the right way round, all that was undone in order to have a robed choir here, sitting on seats specially designed for them. I say that because if you're a little boy, and they were boys, the seats in the front are quite right for you, quite properly proportioned for you. But if you were a big man, you wouldn't want to sit in the front row. And if you want to feel what sitting in the pews compared with sitting in the box pews was like, just go and try those, because they've got vertical backs. And it does actually mean that you do actually have to get up and down in order to stay alive in those choir stalls. Now, the other things, just to say that not everything was facing this way, and so could be actually photographed. There are several things, though, first of all, that are missing. There's no reredos. So up the back there, that depiction of the Last Supper didn't get put in place until almost the beginning of the 20th century, 1894. No choir stalls. They didn't come until 1882 or 3. And no rood loft. Now, this is the last mystery. I cannot resolve this mystery, but some of you will know this book. And it talks about the fact that it was recorded in 1809 that part of the rood loft was still there. So what is a rood loft? It's nothing to do with being rude. It's about the rood, which was the name for the crucifix. Now, the nearest church to here that's actually got a rood loft in place, complete, is Patricia. And you can see this thing at the front on the slide, just in front of the arch. So we're talking about something that would have been just above where I'm standing, across there. And in the book, it says that 1809, part of the rood loft was still there. And we know it can't be true, because 1809, actually, I've got my 1909, the wrong century for a moment, sorry. The rood loft must have gone when this photograph, your photograph there, was taken. So how did this get confused? I don't know is the answer. This is the lady who made the mistake. I can't say what it looked like in 1809, which is when Theophilus Jones said that the rood loft was there and was being used as a belfry. I can't understand the second part of that sentence, because it's difficult to see how you could actually use it as a belfry, and nobody yet has managed to explain that. However, this lady, Mrs. Dawson, wrote a book The Churches of Brecknockshire, in which she describes this church having a rood loft in 1909. Well, we know that's not true, because this photo that I've given you shows no rood loft at all. I think the poor lady says she was ill in her preface to the book, and she wasn't able to complete it in the way that she'd intended. She came from, or she was living at the time, at Skethrog, which is between here and Brecon. You would have thought that she would have actually, even in 1909, would have actually got on her bicycle and come and had a look before she wrote. Not only that about the rood loft, but also that Sir John was still in front of the altar. Now, anybody who's actually gone and seen it here will know that can't be true either. So something went horribly wrong. The sad thing is that has been perpetuated, not in another book, although it's reported in here. If you go on to Wikipedia and you look not at our website, but the website which is called St Edmund's Church, Crickhowell, I think that's what it's called, you will actually find a description which says exactly the same thing. All the text that's in that article is lifted straight out of Theophilus Jones. The American woman who actually wrote that article, I doubt ever came anywhere near this church. Why she wrote it, I don't know. And I've got to do something about it. I should do the editing now that I've discovered it's so wrong. It's just a lift from 1808 without any 1809, without any reference to the fact that it doesn't exist today. I feel sorry for Mrs. Dawson. I've read her story. I know about her. I think she probably was well-meaning, but probably her illness caught up with her. And of course, in those days, she wouldn't have had an editor who'd say, "Are you sure about this?" And so it got perpetuated. There are lots of other things that can't be seen in the picture that happened. I've just mentioned a couple now. Let's get Mrs. Dawson out the way. You'll be familiar with this screen here on the picture, which is that at the back there in front of what we now call the children's area. That actually was built specially to take the organ. Which organ? Not this one, we know, but the previous organ, which is, now who was listening during my talk on the organ? Where did the previous organ go? Nobody know? Not Tritower, no. Cumdy, yes. Cumdy, and it's still there, and it's still being played, and that's another mystery really as to why we felt it necessary to sell that one. Oh, that's the other mystery about that organ moving to Cumdy. In some accounts it says that it was given, but in our account it was sold. So that gives you a very brief overview of what was going on behind the reason for this CDV. There is just one more mystery I have not solved. Who was John's Fieldhouse? I thought for a moment or two that he was just made up, but he wasn't. In an entry in 2 of the trade directories at the time of the CDV being produced, he has an entry, and it just says John Fieldhouse. So we've got his first name. We didn't have that on the thing when we started. New Road. That's in 1875. He was in New Road. Can I find any other reference to him? He managed to avoid both the census before and the census afterwards. I can't find any other reference. I can't find whether he died locally because I can't find a reference to a burial. So if anybody actually stumbles over anybody called John Fieldhouse or their descendants and can tell me something about the man, I'd be only too pleased to have solved that mystery as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Eric. I think I'll take the inverted commas away. You are our church historian.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. And how much you can see in a photograph, which on the face of it looks almost identical with our church as it is, and yet when you can read between the lines, as it were, how much you managed to find out. Amazing, really. Thank you very much. I'm sure we all thoroughly enjoyed that talk. Has anybody got any questions? I realise, yes, Jeanette.
Just thinking that, the amount and the size of the renovations that they did at that particular time, I mean, if we thought of doing anything at all, anything like that, or even like a quarter of it, we would be thinking about the prohibitive cost of doing it. So where did they get their money from?
They got their money. Let me tell you how much it was. £1,485.16 and 4pence. They got it from people like you. I have a list of the subscribers there. A sermon was preached by a local archdeacon. That brought in what the equivalent today would be about £3,000. It wasn't £3,000 in those days, but it's £3,000 today. And lots of gifts. So, for example, the stone for the pillars was given by Lord Glenask. And a whole load of other things that were given by the great and the good around here, of whom there were many, of course. But lots of ordinary people gave money. And it's exactly the same as the similar account for the organ and the Arches Fund that I talked to you about before. It's just amazing what people will give. Because in those days it was very fashionable to make your name public with your sum of your gift. There aren't any anonymous gifts in here, apart from the church collection after the Archdeacon spoke. But it was the way they did things in those days. So you possibly gained a bit of local kudos from the size of your gift. But there are some interesting names in the list. And they almost all, I expect, in this list, were local. John Evans had never been anywhere else. I don't mean he'd not actually gone anywhere else, but he'd never worked anywhere else other than in this church. 35 years he was in this church, which is a long incumbency. And I think he was a very, very much loved man. And he will have actually just smiled very sweetly at people and said, "You will give, won't you?" Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Roger.
Yes, Roger.
You explained how the pulpit has been moved and that was done in order to create space for a choir. But would there have been a smaller choir before? Because there's quite a lot of space there and there's 2 tiers of the choir.
There were pews up there, but the choir would almost certainly have gathered around the organ at the back. So there was space, but it was taken up with, quote, ordinary pews for ordinary people who like to hear the vicar from behind. I think that's the answer.
Well, thank you again, Eric. I think you've managed to even answer our questions very thoroughly, so thank you very much for that. And shall we thank Eric in the usual way?
Thank you.
I believe there's some refreshments for us, and no doubt Eric will be around if you want to sort of ask any questions about anything you've seen this evening.
To see what the church looked like at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. This gives you a good idea. I've got 2 of the same and 1 different here, and particularly as far as the uplighters are concerned, you'll see those quite clearly in those postcards. Teas and coffees are over there, for those of you who don't know.